This week on Reverberate, we open Galatians 2 alongside Matthew 18. Jesus tells us to begin correction in private, yet Paul corrects Peter in public. Was that wrong? We look at Peter's fear, Paul's care, and the way a leader's influence shapes a whole church. We talk about when public correction serves the gospel and why relationships matter, especially in the age of social media. Let's get into it. So, in this situation, we have Peter being publicly criticized by Paul. And we see Christ's wisdom in Matthew 18 of if there's a fault, going to them alone and then presenting it. And it appears that Paul didn't necessarily follow that. He approached Peter in a public setting, and in a way, you mentioned that he was addressing the whole group, but he was addressing the group of Jewish believers that are separating from the Gentiles through Peter and talking to him directly. He was the most influential or the ringleader. So how do we wrestle through that kind of situation where if we see a public figure or a leader in a church that is acting out of step with the gospel and the Spirit leads us to address it, how do we wrestle through that? And I'm thinking especially in this day and age of social media, and things can get very public very fast and very ugly very fast. But there's also times to address criticism and do it in a public way. So how do we wrestle through that wisdom and logic?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things in the text that are really helpful. One, Paul is not addressing Peter merely to try and help the other people. I think sometimes these kinds of rebukes, we aren't really concerned with the person we're rebuking. We're just hoping the people listening change. He's not doing that here. There's a couple clues in the text that tell you that. When Peter came to Antioch, in Galatians 2:11, Paul opposes him to his face because he stood condemned. That could be translated because he condemned himself. And the implication is that there's this internal conflict within Peter. It's not Peter's doing something I think is wrong merely. It's Peter's doing something that actually Peter thinks is wrong, that's inconsistent with himself. That's part of the hypocrisy challenge. So that's one thing he does. Second thing, you can look in verse 12. It says, when the circumcision party came, Peter drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So there's an internal fear here that Paul is trying to address. He's not only trying to say, I need to go after Peter so that these other people don't follow him. There's an element of public in that sense of a public leader and his influence, but he's looking at Peter as somebody who he genuinely cares for relationally, and somebody who he knows, by the way, too, which is an interesting question around our social media world, because it's not like Paul's never related with Peter. He's not a random social media influencer halfway around the globe that has never seen him, right? This is somebody who he knows. He's walked with him as a brother. They're friends. They're co-laborers in the gospel, to the point that he said before, Peter's entrusted with the gospel to the Jews. I'm entrusted with the gospel to the Gentiles. Like, there is very much a personal connection there, and he cares for the fact that Peter is condemning himself and fearing. So he does that. Now, that said, he does rebuke him publicly. I think we get hints from the text as to why he does that too, because he says the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray. So multiple people, they're dropping like flies as Peter's doing this, right? And it specifically says in verse 14, when I saw that their conduct, so he didn't just see Peter's conduct, he saw the group, all of their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. So he goes, because he cares about Peter and sees the internal issue with Peter, and because he sees the impact, he's wisely using influence then to say, I want to help Peter see what he's doing. So do you rebuke a leader in that context? I would say the principles here are, yes, at least sometimes, but you do it with personal care for that leader. You're not attacking just their influence. You care about the leader. Do you do that over social media is a separate question. And that's one that obviously is completely foreign to Scripture because they didn't have social media. I think that in general, we're wiser to stay away from conflict with social media people that we'd have no relationship with. Now, that said, the people who have influence out there on social media, they have friends. And some of their friends might need to jump on social media and say some things. Sure, maybe. but they have a relationship there. That's a different context. I'm not saying we should never do it on social media, but too often it becomes there's this voice out there that becomes my punching bag to try to get at my own attention. That's not remotely what Paul's doing. Like, it's completely out of the spirit of what Paul's doing. And so instead to think, first, this leader needs to have people around him who can help address the issues, the fears, those kinds of things. And then to think, what is the impact? What is the influence of them walking out of step with the gospel? I think there's a place for social media interactions like that, but I think most of us are far better off avoiding being the keyboard warrior and truly loving and pursuing the people we have a relationship with.
Yes, I love all that. I think another thing, though, too, is that we can read about in Galatians why Paul rebuked Peter. I mean, this was very serious. And so sometimes what happens, too, is that you get people who engage in that. And as Jed was saying, I'm glad he said it. It's not that there's never a time for no one to engage in that. There certainly probably is times where someone should engage. But here's the thing. There's a tendency, and I've seen it among people my age and younger and older as well, but like where everything is a Galatians 2 issue. Do you see what I'm saying? And no, Galatians 2, we have an apostle who has this massive influence and is having table fellowship, and out of hypocrisy and fear of the circumcision party leaves to essentially associate with them while he's disassociating with the Gentiles. That is a serious issue. And it's very easy. We can't underestimate how easy it is to get into a habit of seeing everything as a kind of, you stand condemned. You're condemning yourself, like a Galatians 2 type issue. Not everything rises to that level.
Yeah, not everything is a Galatians 2 issue. And there certainly is a place then for, in our social media context, for this public figure states some influential view, and you may feel like, I need to address that. And within a pastoral context, maybe you say, some of you saw this was posted and here's an issue, or you write a blog post or whatever. Like there's a world for that. That's not the same thing as the kind of name-calling attacks that go on. That's not the same thing as just, here, I'm nobody, this guy doesn't know who I am, and none of his followers know who I am, but I'm going to blast at him on his YouTube comments section. I don't think that's likely to produce the fruit you want, and it's also just a waste of time. So pursue things that are more beneficial, I think, is what we're called to. And Jason, you brought up, it doesn't look like Paul followed Matthew 18, because he didn't go talk to Peter in this context. I think that we already do this in other areas where we say the circumstances can influence the way Matthew 18 works. So if someone is, there's an issue and someone's in a sin, that is a private sin and nobody else knows about it. That's one thing. And you go, we're going to go one at a time. We're going to go do that. But if somebody, a professing believer, goes off the rails, they go hold up a bank somewhere and now they're in jail. Do you have to wait for public comment until you can go individually talk to that person? No. Clearly not, right? The circumstances can dictate like that. That is the normal pattern. That's the normal way it works. But there are some times where it escalates to a much more public thing much quicker. This was very public. This wasn't Peter saying, I kind of wonder.
But it wasn't just a public sin. It affected the public. It was his associating with the circumcision party and disassociating with the Gentiles affected that church right then, and every individual in that church.
Absolutely. And not only that, but the individuals from Jerusalem, like Barnabas and the other Jews, like everybody, it was already public by the nature of it. So instead of taking time to go directly to Cephas, he has this conversation, but it's still aimed at loving Peter in this. It's still pointing out Peter's not acting in consistency. Peter's feeling all these external pressures from the circumcision party. And he's probably thinking back to the people he ministers with in Jerusalem, and what are they going to think, and what are they going to hear, and I'm going to have to explain all this, and pastors do this all the time, right? You go, here, this person over here is going to think such and such, what am I going to do about that? Like, it's easy to go there. Peter's got all those external pressures, and then within him, there's this fear, whether it's fear of safety, whether it's fear of disrespect or lack of approval, whatever. So there's this external pressure meeting an internal fear, And he's not responding in the truth of the gospel. He's responding as following those fears instead of the confidence and rest he has in the gospel. That's what Paul is pointing him to. He's not saying, Peter, you idiot. That's not his point. His point is to say, Peter, I see you struggling here. And it's public struggle, so I need to address it publicly. But I'm going to point you back to the things you already know. And when he continues in verse 15 and following, he's not saying anything Peter doesn't know. Peter agrees with all of that. He's just saying, Peter, you're not walking in step with this, with what you would hold most dearly. So the posture of that, and that's where I would go back to the social media question. Especially if you have a relationship with that person such that you can genuinely respond with that posture of, here's something I see in your heart that's harming you and I really want it to be better. Maybe that's a really good thing for you to do. I'm going to go with that's not 99.5% of social media correction that goes on. And so I don't think it really fits the same category as what Paul is actually doing here.
Thank you for listening to Reverberate. Next time we ask, if you're not feeling it in your spiritual walk, is that hypocrisy? How should you react when you feel like you're stapling on the fruit of the Spirit instead of it growing naturally? Should you worry when obedience feels forced? Join us next week for that conversation.